Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
Funding for Washington Week in Review is provided by the people of HMO Iowa, who are working to make quality health care available to families across Iowa. And by ANR Pipeline Company, a subsidiary of the Coastal Corporation and an integral part of the natural gas industry in Iowa, which is proud to help support the Iowa broadcast of Washington Week in Review. And by United Fire and Casualty Company and United Life Insurance Company, together with the independent insurance agents who represent them, are pleased to bring Iowans this opportunity to better understand the world.
A political debate over the Los Angeles riots. Our top story tonight on Washington Week in Review. Ford Motor Company, worldwide manufacturer of automotive products, has provided funding for this program. At Ford, quality is job one. Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you. Now here's moderator Paul Duke.
Good evening. President Bush has seen for himself just how bad the Los Angeles riots were, and he says it's time to move away from race and prejudice to a healing period. But the politics of blame already is shattering hopes for bipartisanship in dealing with the aftermath. Amid signs the violence will be an issue in this year's presidential campaign. Mikhail Gorbachev has made a triumphant return to the United States, but parts of Europe are finding the going a bit rough and adjusting to the post-Gorbachev, post-communist era. Going for us tonight, Hedrick Smith, who's an independent reporter these days. Haynes Johnson of the Washington Post. Gwen Ifill of the New York Times, and Stephen Roberts of U.S. News and World Report. Well, the president obviously was touched and appalled by what he saw in Los Angeles. Steve?
Well, Paul, this was the week when the whole country, but particularly President Bush, came face to face with a rather grim and rather grisly picture, the realities of urban America, which really have been virtually invisible up to now in the campaign. He came into a lot of criticism early in the week that he had not acted quickly enough. He changed his schedule, went out there for 2 days, went through the riot zone, met with local leaders, announced $600 million for aid. And really in this week, what he did was play two very different roles. On one hand, he played the national leader, the head of state, calling for healing. He seemed very touched, genuinely, as you say, by what he saw. This is a man who is pretty isolated and a man of great privilege in his personal background, but it really got through to him, I think. And he did talk a lot about healing, but at the very same time, he was also playing the role very much of a political leader. And in that role, his role was very different from the healer. It's really the divider, and the divider along partisan lines. And in that role, he and his spokesman, Marlon Fitzwater, blamed this all on the what they call the failed democratic policies of the Great Society and the war on poverty. Of course, that led Bill Clinton, the leading Democrat, to fire back immediately, first of all saying it was rather unbelievable that you could blame this on Democrats who have not been in power for most of the last 25 years. And he said it really is, the real cause was the neglect, as he put it, of the Reagan-Bush years. So what you see gelling already is an argument that I think we're going to see a lot of in the weeks and months ahead. And that is the blame on the 60s or is the blame on the 80s?
Who's talking about the 90s?
Well, that's a very good point. I don't think too many people are talking about the 90s because it's a very difficult issue politically, Haynes. You know, for George Bush, what he was trying to do, I think, was rather carefully but directly remind people of why they didn't like the Democrats in the first place 25 years ago, why they started voting Republican, he went out of his way, not only when he was talking about healing, but then he went and saw the police, got his picture taken with the policemen, with the firemen, with the troops he sent in, to remind people that he was the Desert Storm commander. There's a real attempt on the part of Republicans to push some hot buttons, which have really worked to their advantage now for a long time.
What's the truth about those programs? Sorry, excuse me, Paul. But talk about the Great Society. What's the real truth about that? You hear that didn't work, it was a great mirage, no value to it, et cetera, et cetera. We've had enough distance to judge that now.
I think you have to say that it worked in some ways and not in others. I think that in some very important ways, the Great Society did make and continues to make a contribution to this country. For instance, poverty rates have dropped since the advent of the Great Society, virtually in half, and particularly for elderly people. You've got to remember that a lot of the poorest people in this country were elderly people before you had Medicare and before you had increases in Social Security. So that's been very successful. You now have a safety net in place in this country that did not exist in the 60s. Programs like Medicaid, programs like food stamps, and you do have also a growing black middle class.
But if it were a safety net that were working, we wouldn't have seen what we saw in the past week and a half in Los Angeles. We saw a great deal of politics played by both Bill Clinton and George Bush in their trips to Los Angeles, and they both went to their black churches, and they both went in and shook a cop's hand, and they all made their point. The question is, was there a greater responsibility on the part of the president, who is the leader of Democrats and Republicans, to play down that sort of politicking than there was on the part of the likely Democratic nominee?
Well, you certainly can say that there is a greater responsibility. The president is supposed to be the president of all the people. But the fact is, and we have to be fairly frank about this, the Republicans for 25 years have seldom avoided the temptation to play the race card politically in this country. It goes back to the 60s when Richard Nixon ran as a law and order president. In the 70s, Ronald Reagan, in the late 70s, he ran for president in 1980, talking about welfare queens, associating the Great Society programs with minorities and with waste and
crime in the streets.
Crime in the streets. So there has been a consistent impulse. Willie Horton was only a continuation of that, to use that issue to divide people.
Isn't there a larger point here? I mean, at some point, if you win the White House over a period of time, the people tend to take you as being responsible for policies. As you pointed out, the Republicans have been in the White House for a very long time. You can hardly say, elect me again and I'll change your future, and then say, by the way, I didn't affect your past. I mean, well, can the president really hold the 60s responsible for the 90s and skip the 80s?
It's a very difficult political feat to try to do. But of course, this is part of the broader campaign theme. This is a man who has baptized himself as the candidate of change after having been in the administration for 11 years. That's a great feat of political distortion. But we also have to say that there's a growing consensus for all the successes of the Great Society programs, which we've acknowledged. There have been some failures. I think there's a growing consensus that the big bureaucratic programs run out of Washington, where there were rules that affected the whole country, didn't relate to local conditions, there's a sense that that's failed. And there's been a sense that in some ways the programs have been victimized by their own success, because if you maintain too much of a safety net, there's the argument that what you do is create welfare dependency, and that there's no incentive for people to get off welfare to go become more productive. And a lot of what the discussion now is, how do you change those big Washington-centered programs to a more locally centered, individual-centered program?
Well, one of the things the president has been saying is that he does want some new ideas, some new plans, but Gwen, we see at this point no signs that we're going to get any kind of bold new urban policy at the federal level.
You're absolutely right, Paul. What you hear everyone talking about, Republicans and Democrats alike, are buzzwords: partnerships, personal responsibility, empowerment. Now, if you listen closely, you'll realize you've been hearing these same phrases for at least 25 years, and you've been hearing them at least during the last dozen years from the Reagan and the Bush administrations. They've been a little bit muted in the last 3 years, as Jack Kemp has been the person who's talked about them a lot.
He's the housing secretary.
The housing secretary. The housing secretary who basically has been kept out in the cold during the past 3 years until this last week when he became very vital to the administration. But you also have to keep in mind that you've heard the same things coming increasingly and surprisingly, it would seem, from people like Jesse Jackson on the left. and people like Bill Clinton, who's trying to fashion this moderate stance. So what you have is both sides not talking about anything terribly new, but talking about home ownership for public housing tenants, talking about enterprise zones, which is basically capital gains tax breaks for the inner cities for small businesses, which you can argue about all of these programs. Head Start is a way to send kids to school, to start at the very youngest and encourage people. College tuition assistance. Both Republicans and Democrats are talking about these ideas. The question then becomes, how much does it cost to do it, which nobody seems to ever have a very easy answer for, and what is the commitment to doing it, which the Bush administration has had these things before them, certainly in the last 3 years, coming from their housing secretary, and haven't acted.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, it isn't that we haven't had experience with money or programs or things that work or don't work. Is there a kind of a commitment? Do you think there will be now? Is this for real, or is it just more rhetoric?
Well, the package of aid that the president announced for Los Angeles is not a lot of money, and there's not a lot of money to be had. And so the question immediately becomes whether it's the government's responsibility to do the rescuing anymore.
Isn't it a larger question? Isn't it a question as to whether or not society as a whole begins to believe that this is our problem? Is it their problem in the inner city, or is it our problem as a whole? Politicians aren't going to move, are they, until the society as a whole is ready to do something about it?
There's no question but that America has become more divided and less together over the last decade. And that as long as people are more separated from each other and thinking that their goals are in common, the more this sort of thing is going to happen.
Furthermore, we hear this division extends into the inner councils of the White House. Apparently, Vice President Quayle, Chief of Staff Sam Skinner favors some kind of emphasis that gives greater attention to law and order in dealing with some of these problems, while other presidential assistants and some prominent Republican senators on Capitol Hill think the White House approach should really emphasize the thing which Rick was just alluding to, namely the social conditions in the country.
Well, backpedaling to the politics of the matter, it is clear that Republicans have always benefited from the arguments about law and order, and that Democrats are always the ones who have the strength on social policy issues, and that if the Republicans can shift the argument to being one about law and order, and if the riots had, God forbid, gone on a day or two more, George Bush would have been able to reap an immediate benefit. But as soon as it becomes a question of what does the government do in an untenable situation where pumping money into it is not the question, in which at the root of it is still an economy which is growing more slowly than it has in decades, that's not an easy problem for them to solve.
Well, Chris, you also have, when you talk about the politics of this and the prospects for legislation, the reason why Bill Clinton and the Democrats have not talked a lot about the poor in this campaign is because they've determined that that's not where the votes are. The votes are in the white middle class, which are feeling increasingly squeezed and feel increasingly resentful of money spent on the urban poor. So given that political setup, is the will really there? Is the political clout really there to take on this issue, not only in the White House, but in the Congress?
Well, I have to say that the middle class certainly has gotten its share of attention in terms of middle class tax cuts being proposed by candidates and everyone fighting for their votes and their hearts. But I also would say that it would be fair to Bill Clinton to say that he has been talking about the questions of racial division since this campaign began, certainly before he was in the South, certainly when he was in New Hampshire, which doesn't have a whole lot of minority population. So the discussion has been on the table. It never became a pressing issue until bombs were thrown and neighborhoods were on fire. And it's unclear to me to what degree of sensitivity and real commitment there's going to be out of a temporary flare-up over the long term.
We had a new unemployment report today which shows that the economy is beginning to come back, at least in small ways. But when you come right down to it, aren't jobs the real answer to most of this?
Jobs are absolutely the answer. 40,000 jobs were wiped out in Los Angeles in 3 days of rioting. But a tenth of a percent uptick in the economy is not going to save George Bush on this issue, and it's not going to save Bill Clinton either.
Isn't it also true that the question of values has been talked a lot about in the last few days? And in the 60s, I covered the beginnings of the poverty programs in the 60s in New York. There was a hope, perhaps naive, that government could solve most, if not all, of these problems with enough money. Increasingly, I sense that there's an understanding that there's a dimension here, spiritual dimension, moral dimension, the government really can't deal with.
Well, I was in Philadelphia this week where a local inner city church is building a whole new church and starting its own supermarket and its own businesses in that area. And maybe that's where the future lies, where people are taking it into their own hands.
Americans have certainly experienced a special sadness over the events in Los Angeles, and probably no more so than in the South, Haynes.
Well, it's so strange listening to this conversation here. A week ago, I went back to, just happened to be, by luck or circumstance or unhappy times, to go back to places I haven't been in 25, 30 years. Birmingham, Alabama, where the violence began with the police dogs and Bull Connor that energized the world and led to the March on Washington and really energized Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. And then I went on down to Selma, and I was talking to try to find out where things are in race and economics in these areas. And on the surface, if you go back to the Birminghams of Selma, I mean, it's a whole world apart. I mean, the cities look prosperous, blacks in all kinds of positions of authority, black police chiefs, black officials, black heads of schools, and so forth. And yet, what I was hearing before the riots began, this was interesting, on both blacks and whites, growing polarization, what you were talking about, growing distance between the race, growing fear of tensions in American life. In Birmingham, as an example, skinheads, the neo-Nazis, whatever one wants to call, were arrested for beating to death a homeless black. There were demonstrations before the riots began when I was there. Going down to Selma, the same kind of tensions, not violence, but fear of it, this sort of sense. And then after it was over, I had a conversation, everything we've been talking about here, what it comes down to is something very personal. It's not a matter of programs or politics or black or white. It's about what you're talking about, the larger question of a society. It was deja vu eerie to watch, to me, having been in Selma when the Voting Rights Act was passed after violence, a reaction to police violence, and had to send in the federal guards and federal marshals and all of that, and led the ability to march, to protest, and register to vote. That was done.
Isn't there a disturbing undercurrent here all along?
Absolutely.
This whole idea that we are not where we thought we were.
Absolutely.
And there's this thin veneer of civility, and in fact, it's not there at all?
Absolutely. The last conversation I had in Selma before I went back was with a younger black man who was running for Congress, quite remarkable figure, and he talked about how he felt now. Harvard Law graduate, came back to the black belt of the South, and with passion. Whites think he's too radical, too racist. That's part of the undercurrent. He said he felt a greater burden on him than he's ever felt in his life because he felt it was like what Reconstruction must have been. There was progress after the Civil War, and you had a sense that you were stepping back into the potential darkness. And I don't mean to suggest the South is as bad as the urban North. It's what Rick is saying. It's the American question.
But it makes it plain that race remains the great divide in America. And one of the most striking things here in the Capitol is that very few politicians actually talk about this issue. John Danforth, the senator from Missouri, Bill Bradley, the senator from New Jersey. There are two exceptions, but they are rare.
But what we're talking about here, and what Steve said, it's invisible, the cities, but they aren't invisible. We all know, if you go to the center of Washington, D.C., 42% of the black males in this city between age 18 and 35 are involved in the criminal justice system, either in jail or otherwise. It's worse today than it was in the 68 riots. And so there's a class as well as race.
Don't you have a have and a have-not situation? It isn't just economic, but it's have skills and have-not skills.
You have
not just money, but it's the ability to enter the mainstream job market.
Why is this all of a sudden an issue which has gotten people's attention? Why does it take fire? I mean, certainly Bill Bradley and Jack Danforth have been talking about this on Capitol Hill. When black politicians have talked about this, they've been dismissed as being paranoid or being too concerned about self or being too wrapped up in some sort of mind game or power game, when in fact it's not that this hasn't been talked about. It's been talked about a great deal, but always by people who've been somehow considered to be discredited politically.
We always wait until the fire starts before we begin to commission reports and study, and then we begin maybe to act, and then we don't. You go back and reread the Kerner Commission reports on the riots in 1967. After the urban riots, you went through the nonviolent protests in the South, and then you went into the urban riots in the North, and now we're almost coming back to the same cycle. And I think it's a deeper problem. In the urban centers, every city, including little towns like Selma, there are now gangs. It didn't used to be there. There's crack cocaine. There's a sort of a pattern of behavior with absolute despair, and that's how they make money. They can't live otherwise.
But isn't it also true, and I wondered what your reflections on this are, one of the striking differences from the 60s, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Many of these cities are led by blacks, as Birmingham is. The police forces are not occupying armies of alien forces. Absolutely. They are large representation of minorities in the police forces. In Los Angeles, there's a black mayor, black congressman. Does that make any difference?
Sure, it makes a difference. I mean, if you think that anybody who thinks it's more despairing today in the sense of the larger question, the context of race, which was totally segregated. Obviously, opportunity works for some, but not for all. That's the distance. And the question Gwen asked is the key. Why does it take us so long to face problems that could destroy the whole country?
Rick,
isn't at least part of it the fact that you've been taught the policies of separatism and the policies of selfishness?
And I have to say, watching the politics of this blame and recrimination, you come back and talk to the people, what they really want is to get on with things, and that they realize there are problems, and the fear that exists in the northern cities and now tremoring around the country is the American dilemma still.
As Gunnar Myrdal, the great Swedish social scientist, said many, many years ago. Rick, you were in Europe when the Los Angeles tragedy occurred. What was the reaction?
You know, it's interesting. I was really just in Germany, not all over Europe, and of course it was enormous headlines and on all the television, and not only the immediate events, but the replaying many times, of course, of the tape of the beating of Rodney King and the trial and so forth. And there's a sense of tragedy, a sense of being appalled at America going through this convulsion once again, a sense of sadness, a sense of relief that it's not their problem. And also, interesting enough, a number of people said to me, you know, your cities are too big, you've got too many people there, and occasionally you'd hear, your society doesn't work. You begin to get that judgment. And it's interesting because you get it in other areas too in terms of economic competitiveness, but this is taken as another piece of evidence. We were talking about it earlier before the program, not a sense of lording it over Americans, not that, because the Europeans are enormously preoccupied with their own problems, and the Germans have got 170,000 Turks in Berlin, 1.7 million Turkish people, and Serbs and Croats and so forth as their guest workers, as they call them. And they are preoccupied with those problems, but there is a sense that, oh, you've got a different order of problems there in America. But the German strike that we saw this past week, and by the way, which we had to snake our way through as we made our way around Germany, is a symbol of some of the problems they have. I mean, West Germany is now trying to swallow and reintegrate, talk about a divided society, East Germany. And the strike is one of the indications and symbols there that some people there don't want to have to pay the price for that. I mean, we're talking about paying the price for social programs here. West German laborers movement is one of the most prosperous, has long vacations, high wages, short working hours, all kinds of social benefits. And Kohl, as the chancellor, is saying to them, you know, you can't keep pushing this because we got to have some of that money to bring the Easterners up to us. And that's what you got. You began to get social confrontation there.
Of course, in this country, we've been talking so much in recent years about the decline of the American labor movement, that, in part because of international competitiveness, because of the feeling that the labor unions have driven price of American goods up too high, and the work rules are antiquated, and Americans can't compete. We're starting to see some of the same thing in Germany. And why is compare the German labor movement to here?
German labor movement is extraordinarily powerful. About half of the labor force is in the labor movement as opposed to, 20% here. And almost everybody else's wages are affected by it. And one of the reasons is the German labor movement was extremely responsible after World War II in getting together with management, having long periods where there weren't strikes. And management was also extremely responsible. Most people aren't aware of it, but some of the most outspoken German labor leaders sit on the management boards of the biggest corporations, Deutsche Bank, Daimler-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, so forth, down the line. The workers' councils have real power. There is a system of collaboration. In fact, one of the reasons why the strike this week was so unusual and so dramatic to Germans was precisely because that kind of open confrontation is rare in German society. Labor unions are very much accepted as a good part of their competitiveness, not something to be beaten down.
Take the longer view. They have their problems right now as we have problems we've had throughout our history, as a matter of fact. But is the unification going to work? It costs more. It's more turbulent than they had expected. Where do you see it 10, 15 years down?
Well, I got to tell you, the first thing, after having been to Russia plenty of times, the difference between East Germany and Russia is extraordinary. I mean, we were in Berlin, and walking around, you begin to see Citibank and American Express having offices opening up overnight, new hotels and so forth. We drove down 250 miles into Saxony, down to a town called Jena, where the Carl Zeiss Optic Works, one of the prides and joys of the East German optical high-tech industry has lost 17,000 workers, but they're being rehired and it's being reworked. You pass a new furniture plant, you drive through the town square and you find out, my God, instead of the old East German cars, they've got Opels, they've got Fords, and so the money is getting around. There's a new drugstore, the new bookstores. It's all over the place. But production at the big plants has fallen. Now, what I heard from the head of the Treuhand, the institution that's privatizing East German industry, production's fallen off 60% in 18 months. But they say we've hit bottom and it's beginning very slowly to edge up. So it's very rough. It's a rocky road, but the West Germans are are footing the bill.
Let me bring you back home again, Rick. Russian expert that you are, did you ever expect to see the day when Mikhail Gorbachev would come to America, put on a cowboy hat, and make a speech from the same platform where Winston Churchill made his immortal speech about the Iron Curtain in Missouri?
Well, I got to tell you, the business about Gorbachev putting on a cowboy hat, putting his arm around Ronald Reagan, and receiving the Freedom Medal at the Reagan Library did not surprise me one bit. That is a Reagan-Gorbachev duo that they've worked out a long time in advance.
Except it was a bad cowboy hat. Ronald Reagan got the good cowboy hat.
That's right. All hat and no cattle, right? But in any case, the speech in Fulton, Missouri was really unusual. I mean, to think here we are that many years after Winston Churchill, 46 years, and here's the fellow who says, ringing down the end of the Cold War.
He seemed to be saying, you've won the Cold War, but
don't lord it over us. That's right. Don't gloat about it. There was a little bit of argument over history, whether or not it was Stalin or whether or not the nuclear arms race began with us. But I think basically Gorbachev's message was we got to think about a united world, strengthen the United Nations, think about human rights, look to the new era.
And that after all, taking a page out of Jimmy Carter's book, How to Be a Good Ex-President?
I think the message is around. That's what you do. You don't hang up your hat, your cowboy hat, or any other kind of hat. Certainly not your Russian fur hat. But I think he's a better media politician, Gwen. He's out there. He knows how to work it. He's going all the way from Ronald Reagan on the West Coast to Teddy Kennedy in Boston.
And
at the end of next week.
Here, not so much maybe in his
well,
own
that's
country.
right. It's also much better overseas.
It's also true that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are going to be linked together in history.
Yeah.
They really they always have depended on each other, and in history they will depend on each other as the two symbols of that reconciliation.
Interesting also that Reagan found time to come out for a photo op for Gorbachev, but not for George Bush when he was out in California.
And the crowning footnote to all of this is that we have to say it was Gorbachev who finally did bring down the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, there's no question.
And I must bring down our own little curtain at this point. That's it for this edition. I'm Paul Duke. Good night for all of us here on Washington Week.
If you like listening to a different beat, try out the sounds of Alma Iwana tonight on IPTV. Their sounds embrace the music of the Andes, and you'll hear them on Living in Iowa at 8:30.
Washington Week in Review was produced by WETA, which is solely responsible for its content. Ford Motor Company, worldwide manufacturer of automotive products, has provided funding for this program. At Ford, quality is job one. Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Washington Week in Review, Journal Graphics, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado 80203, or call 303-831-9000.
Funding for Washington Week in Review is provided by the people of HMO Iowa, who are working to make quality health care available to families across Iowa. And by ANR Pipeline Company, a subsidiary of the Coastal Corporation and an integral part of the natural gas industry in Iowa, which is proud to help support the Iowa broadcast of Washington Week in Review. And by United Fire and Casualty Company and United Life Insurance Company, together with the independent insurance agents who represent them, are pleased to bring Iowans this opportunity to better understand the world.
we going in the next millennium? And what will we take with us? Join host David Mayberry Lewis on a 10-hour journey across 6 continents, seeking tribal wisdom for the modern world on the Millennium Series.
Premieres Monday evening at 8.